All right, hey there, fellow coder. Welcome to this next lesson in our series where we are creating a Spring Boot / React web application from scratch. In this lesson, we are going to dive into the idea that when we are having to log in to our application, we need to have a proper way to log in with a proper username and password and check and whatnot. Now, we have all the individual pieces in place to do this, as we have covered in past videos in this series, in this playlist, but we have not put all those pieces together. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. If you haven't already watched all the previous lessons in this playlist, please go back and do so. If you have and you're ready to rock, let's do it. All right, fellow coder. So let's get into it. In our code that we had created previously, we have a login method in our API/auth endpoint. And this allows us to actually log in with a username and password. This is what this auth credentials request is. It's just a username and a password. So we pass that in a request body that we will be sending along with a post request. And then that will do all of our authentication mechanism, and we'll actually return a token, a JWT, JSON Web Token, if we are properly validated. So really, we just need to put all these pieces together. So in our front end, when we have our username password, we should have a submit button that actually takes the data in the username and password fields and sends it along in a post request to our server side. Again, I'm still a little sick. Sorry about the congestion and coughs. I will do my best. So in our login page, which is right here, we should have a mechanism for submitting this data. So we should have a button, ID equals, I don't know, submit or something. And the type can be button. And on click of this guy, it should execute some sort of a function. Okay, this is how we do this in the world of React. So on click, it should execute a function. So the function can be send login request or something. Okay. So this will be the function that is going to execute. And in the world of React, when we want to execute a function inside of an on click like this, we don't actually send the function like this, because what that's going to do is that's going to actually invoke the function when we fire up the application and we visit this screen, or this component is rendered. It's actually going to execute that immediately. So that's what's happening here. You're saying execute the function. So we don't want it to execute the function immediately or invoke the function immediately. We want to just say, hey, when we click on this button, this particular button here, we want it to then execute this function. And you do that by sending a reference to the function itself, sort of like this. Now, it's saying, well, I don't know what this is. This function doesn't exist. Can we do a quick fix and create it? No, we can't. So we need to create this function, right? So one way to do it is just to say function, send login request, like this, and then you can actually have it do something like, say, log, and say, hey, I'm sending a request, right? So just so we can check and see that it's working. Now, also, we forgot to give the button some text. So it's not a self-closing tag here. We need to have it actually say, like, log in or something, and then have the button closing like that. So now we can see the button. And when we click on it, if we go to the console, it says, I'm sending a request. Let me clear the log and show you that again. I'm sending a request. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So every time I click, it's going to say, I'm sending a request. So just to show you that that works, this is how you sort of set things up. So for our login component, we should have a way to send a login request. So how do we send a login request, you might ask? Well, remember back in our app.js in the previous lesson, we commented out all of this code. Well, guess what? We need to sort of access this code. So let me cut this code out, and I will paste it into my login component code inside of the send login request. Paste it here. Now, we don't want it to be a useEffect hook, so we don't need this to fire as soon as it loads the screen. So we'll get rid of the useEffect hook code. We will uncomment everything else, And we also don't need to check for a JWT, because what we're going to do is we're going to log in whether or not we have a JWT available. We also wanted to set the JWT if we do successfully log in, right? So we will have the JWT set JWT code here, where we set it equal to our use local state default value of blank, and the key in this case is JWT. Oops. Okay, so that way we'll have the setter method, and it will set the JWT into our local storage for our browser. Cool. Now we don't want to hard code the username and password either, right? We want the username and password to come from our front end, our code that we have down here, right? We have a username and a password. So how can we grab the details of the input type email and password? How do we pass this along? Well, this is a different mechanism that is used in React, which is like binding. We're going to be binding the input types to a variable. Okay, so how do we do that? So this part gets a little bit tricky, and you have to bear with me. But basically what we want to do is we want to, like I said, tie these inputs into a variable or variables that are tracked appropriately by React. So what we can do is we can leverage our useState hook. So we use the useState hook in this case because we don't want to store it locally. We just want to have a look at our login page with our username and password. The values that we type in the username and password here, we don't need to store them forever in the browser, right? We just want to look at the current state of the page, and as the state changes, we want to then consider those changes and update our variables accordingly, such that when we click on the login button, it will send our request with the current state of our text boxes. So the whole point of useState is to track the state and the changes as they happen with every single keystroke or every single change that happens on the page from the user who's interacting with our page. So for this useState, we'll start it with a default value of empty, because that's essentially what we have for the username and password, is just empty values. And then we can assign this useState to the getter and setter, the getter being username and the setter being set username equals useState. Simple as that. Okay, and we do the same thing for password. Password, set password, useState, empty as the default value. Okay, let me save. So we have a username and a password variable that we've created. They will not be stored forever. They're just, going to be stored on the inside of this view as we're changing the look and the state. In other words, we're changing the text boxes, but we haven't hooked these up to the text boxes yet. We need to bind them to the text boxes. So how do we do that? Well, there's the input type email and input type password. For the input type email, the username, if you don't already know, text boxes have a value, right? You can set the value equal to something. So we can set it equal to not a string, but equal to an object being our username that we defined above, right here. So we can use, so whenever the value of username, the variable itself changes, we're going to show that change as the value of this input box, right? So the value of username will show up there. Same for password. The value of the password variable will show up on the screen, right? So when we reload the page and nothing happens, if we were to set a default value of like test here and say save, look, it shows up right here. But if we try to change this, if I try to type anything in, it's not going to let me change it because we haven't told it what to do when the text box changes, right? So it's not going to modify the underlying value of the username variable if we try to change the text box. Oops. So how do we, let me get rid of the test default value. That will reset it back to be blank. So how do we tell it that, hey, when you change the input text or input type email here, and same with password, how do we tell it that when we change the value of this input box, we want to update the value of the username variable? Well, thankfully, just like we have an on click down here on our button, there's a whole bunch of other on events. on change, on click, on composition, copy, paste, drag. There are a ton of events that we can play with the React language. So we can say on change. So when this input type email changes, when the username changes, we can do something. Well, we want to update the value of the username. So how do we do that? Well, we have to invoke the setter method. So we need to invoke the value of set username. We need to not invoke the value, invoke the function set username and pass it the username that we want to set the username to be, right? Whenever you invoke a setter method, if you know in the Java language, there's a set and then property that you want to set. And then there's in the parameters, the input parameters is one parameter, and that is the parameter that you want to use to update the value of the underlying thing, right? So the set has an input of one parameter, which is the value that you want to set it to. So how do we do that? Again, just like we did down here, same concept. We're passing it the function. We're not gonna invoke the function right away. We're going to pass it the function that we want to invoke, which is going to be sort of this. It's not exactly this, set username. It's almost this, but if you look and consider what's happening here when we're passing it the set username function, it's not telling it what to update the username to be. So it's just going to pass in nothing. So this value of the username is just going to be undefined. So that's not helpful, right? We're not telling it what to set the username to be here. We need to pass something in here in the scope of this, username. Again, we could pass in test here, and if I update this and then I click and I type in anything, it's going to set it to test, right? And I can't change it again because it's just setting the username. It's hard coding the username to be test. Okay, so that's not helpful for on change. How do we get this? How do we make this work? How do we get our input to actually pass in the keystrokes that I'm typing in? Well, there is a parameter that we can pass in here. You can call this, it's actually an event, right? So on change, most of these on whatevers, on click, on change, on bind, on drag, on drop, on whatever, the whole gamut of different on whatevers that you can do typically pass in an event. Okay, so on whatever passes in an event that we can actually look at and use. Now this event is helpful because if we take a look at it, you can take a look at it, but take my word for it. The event has something called target. Target means for the event that was just fired, what is the target that it was fired from or to, right? So the target in this case is going to be our text box. Our text box is the target for this event. And when we say event.target, we get the text box that is being triggered by this onChange event, and then we can grab the value of that target. So we're grabbing the value of the changed text box, right? That's what's happening here. So when I type in a keystroke, when I type in the letter T or the letter E or whatever number on the keyboard, as I'm typing in a keystroke, it's going to say, oh, there's an event that fired. What is the target for that event? Oh, it's the username text box. And what is the event that just happened there? What's the value of that event? It's going to be the letter that's being updated, or rather the value of the entire text box, I should say. So this is how we do it. We say event.target.value. So when I save this, okay, and I come over here and I hit delete, it actually deletes. And if I type in T, it's actually doing something. It's actually typing something in. And what you don't see in the background is that as I'm typing the keystrokes in here, it's updating this variable. So up here, the username is being updated. So we can actually take a look at this username, the value of it as it's changing. So if I do a log here and say username, it's going to fire a console log every time this changes. So if I hit backspace, boom, look at that right here. This is the value of our text box, right? And it's also outputting the, let me get rid of that. On app.js, it's doing a console log here. I'm gonna delete that, and that should hopefully reduce the noise in our console. Oops. You provided a value prop to a form field without onChange. What did I do? Do I just save all? No. I provided a value where? What is this? This is the login page. Yeah, this is what I was doing, right? User, oops. Cancel. What am I doing? Where am I? Console log. So why is that? Hold on, let me refresh. Okay, it's not happy. On change, blah, blah, blah. Oh, probably because it's down here on the password. So the password is complaining because we provided a value, but we didn't provide the on change. So we need to do the same thing for our password as well. So on change equals event is being passed in, okay? And then we want to set the password to be event.target.value. Let me save that, and hopefully that'll get rid of that error message. Yeah, now that's gone. And it's still saying updating local storage value. So that's, where's that coming from? Oh, where do we output that stuff in the dashboard? No. Let me do a search for updating local storage. Interesting. Oh, updating local storage, use local storage. Here we go. We have this console logs in our use local storage component. So every time we were using local storage, it was outputting that stuff to the console and bringing us some noise. There we go. So the noise is eliminated there. Okay, so now as we type in a username, TREVOR, we see that it's slowly updating every single time. And that makes sense because every time it changes the state of that object, React reacts to the change and it fires this console log. Because that's what happens up here. Remember, in the scope of this, of all this here, inside the scope of everything between the opening bracket of your component to before the return, anytime anything changes on this view, the component is going to fire this code up here. It's going to keep on rerunning this code. So anyway, just to show you that the username variable is being properly updated with the value that's typed into the username text box. So we're in a good spot now. We have this way of updating our username, our state. So for username and password, we're updating the state accordingly. Also, quick little thing, if you want to, this could be abbreviated to just E. So instead of typing in event, you can just type in E, like so. Okay, and that way it's just a little bit more succinct. It's just less typing. But then again, you do give up readability because what is E really? E could be error, E could be event, E could be what. So anyway, that's just that's a common thing that you see as it gets abbreviated to just E. Okay, cool. So now we have almost everything we need, but the one problem here is in our request body, we are hard coding the username and the password. We don't want to do this, right? So we want to, instead of saying Trevor, we want to pass in username. And instead of saying password, ASDF, we want to send in password. So now our request being sent to the server side is going to change depending on what we've typed into our form, which is exactly what we want to have happen, right? So now when I say log in, we get an unauthorized return code. We get a 401 unauthorized. So that's good. Now, what's bad is we don't have any messaging up here to say anything. So what we could do is we could pass in, we could look at the response and we can have like an alert message or something show up. So basically what we could do is we could wrap this in body code. So we can insert some body to our code and we can say, hey, if the response status means the status code, if the status is 200, meaning status is okay, then you can return a promise. Okay, you can return that promise where everything's okay. Else, if something went wrong, if it was not a 200 code, you can return promise.reject. Okay, with a message, and the rejection message can be something like, you know, invalid login attempt. Okay, so instead of resolving it to, instead of sending it to the body here to try to set the JWT with the authorization header, all this stuff, this won't work if it's an invalid login attempt, which is why you see this error here saying unexpected end of JSON input. There was no JSON input there when we tried to log in and failed to log in because it doesn't return any body or header, I think. I shouldn't say It probably does return headers, but it probably doesn't return a body. So anyway, it wouldn't work. It breaks. So that's where you need to return promise.reject. And when we reject the promise, we need to have a catch on our, do this, then that, and then we can catch essentially the rejected, the message that was sent along with the rejected promise. So then we can show an alert message and just say, show the message that was rejected up here. So this invalid login attempt is what will be passed in as the input to the catch method. So let me save this. So now when I say login, it'll say, hey, invalid login attempt, and we won't see this uncaught exception, right? So if I clear the console and say login, all we're going to see is the unauthorized, which is good because we are unauthorized. But if we do ASDF, which is the proper password, and say login, you see nothing happens. We don't see an error message. So what should we do here? Because when we click login, something should happen, right? Well, that's where when we go set JWT here, we want it to then do something. We want it to not only just set the JWT, but since we're on a login page, we should probably send it to like the dashboard or something like that. So we can do a window.location, location.href, and we can just manually send it to the dashboard page, right? We can hard code that. So basically when I say login, it redirects to the login page, and there we go. Okay, so that's sort of the that's the gist of what we have going on here. So I think that's pretty much the bare bones way to do a login page. Again, it's not very sexy looking. It doesn't look great, but the functionality is there, and now we can move forward and do something with this functionality with this login page and whatnot. So we have it redirecting to the login page if we are trying to access a page that's protected and we are not logged in. So if we try to access the dashboard, and I'll show you again that functionality that I'm talking about. So we go to application and go to local storage in our 3000. We delete our JWT, so we get rid of it, and then we try to access the dashboard. Now technically we're not logged in anymore. So we try to access dashboard, refresh, it redirects us to the login page, right? And now we have to log ourselves in, and then we can say login, it puts the JWT there, and then we go on to the dashboard appropriately. So the functionality is there. Again, it's not pretty, but it's there. So from this, we can now move forward and actually start to make some progress in the, the rest of the functionality of our actual application. So far, what we've done is a lot of just JWT security related boilerplate stuff that you would need to do for any project. But now we can actually start working on the real functionality. So we can actually start to make this assignment submission app work the way an actual assignment submission app should work. So I look forward to doing that in the next video. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a like. Please do subscribe above me, I guess is where you'll see it. If you don't, it'll show up soon. Go above me to subscribe so you can see the rest of these videos in the series as they are released. Obviously, click the notification bell if you really don't want to miss them as they come out. And hopefully you enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to giving you the next one. So take care of yourselves. As always, happy learning, and bye for now.